I never imagined my marriage would end this way. I never thought I'd be standing in my own home, fists clenched, heart pounding, watching the woman I once loved scream at me like I was the villain. But here I was. It started with a feeling, an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. Late nights at work, the sudden change in her perfume, the way she'd turn her phone screen away when I walked into the room. I told myself I was being paranoid. I told myself I was imagining things. Then, last night, I found the hotel receipt. I clenched it in my fist as I sat in my car, staring at the address. It wasn't far. A high-end place, the kind of hotel we used to go to when we were still happy. My stomach twisted as I imagined her there, sprawled across a bed that wasn't ours, whispering things she once whispered to me. I had to know. I drove. The hotel lobby smelled like expensive cologne and fresh flowers. The receptionist barely glanced at me as I walked past, my heart hammering. The elevator ride felt endless, the little light above the doors flicking from number to number like a countdown to disaster. Room 714. My hand hesitated over the handle. What if I was wrong? What if this was some terrible misunderstanding? But deep down, I already knew the truth. I could feel it in my bones. I turned the handle. And my world shattered. The door wasn't locked. That was the first thing that struck me, how easy it was to step inside, like I was meant to see it, meant to suffer. The room smelled of her perfume, mixed with something heavier, muskier. The curtains were drawn, the golden glow of the bedside lamp casting long shadows over tangled sheets. And there, in the middle of it all, was my wife. She was on top of him, her blonde hair cascading down her bare shoulders, her nails digging into his chest. His hands gripped her hips, holding her steady as their bodies moved in sync. It was a scene ripped straight from my worst nightmares, only worse, because it was real. For a second, they didn't notice me. The sounds they were making drowned out the quiet click of the door. I stood frozen, the receipt still crushed in my fist, my breath shallow. My body screamed at me to move, to do something, but my mind was trapped in slow motion. Then she looked up. Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a brief, horrible moment, she didn't react. Then, realization dawned, and her face twisted in shock. Oh, shit. She scrambled off him, yanking the sheets around her. The guy, some broad-shouldered, dark-haired prick, sat up, blinking like an idiot. He wasn't ashamed. He wasn't afraid. He just looked, annoyed. Who the hell are you? He asked lazily, wiping a hand across his mouth. That's what broke me. I lunged. The room blurred as I crashed into him, my fist connecting with his jaw. He grunted, falling back against the headboard. My wife shrieked, some high-pitched, hysterical sound that barely registered in my ears. Then I felt her hands clawing at my arm. Stop it. Stop it, you psycho, she screamed, nails digging into my skin. I turned, breathing hard. Her face was red, twisted with fury, but there was no guilt. No remorse. Just pure, seething rage. I can't believe you just barged in here like a lunatic, she spat. I stared at her, my chest heaving. Are you seriously mad at me? My voice barely sounded like my own. She yanked the sheet tighter around her, stepping between me and her lover. What the hell is wrong with you? You have no right to come in here. I let out a hollow laugh. No right? You're my wife. She scoffed. Oh, don't pull that card now. Maybe if you weren't such a boring, pathetic little man, I wouldn't have had to find someone who actually knows how to satisfy me. The words hit like a knife to the gut. I staggered back, my fists trembling. The guy behind her snorted, rubbing his jaw. Man, just take the L and get the hell out. I turned my gaze on him, my blood boiling. Shut your damn mouth before I. Oh, please, my wife cut in, rolling her eyes. You're not gonna do anything. You've never had the balls to. Her words sliced deeper than any knife could. I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized that the woman I had loved, the woman I had built a life with, was gone. Maybe she had been gone for a long time. Maybe I had just been too blind to see it. Something inside me cracked. I took one last breath, forcing my hands to unclench. Then, slowly, I stepped back. My wife smirked, thinking she had won. She had no idea what was coming next. I stood there, breathing heavily, my fists still trembling from the adrenaline. The air in the hotel room was thick with tension, heavy with betrayal. My wife, no, not my wife anymore, not after this, stood with her arms crossed, her face twisted in a sneer. The sheet she clutched around her body did nothing to hide the marks he had left on her, reminders of just how deep her betrayal ran. "Are you done?" she spat. "Or do you want to keep embarrassing yourself?" "Embarrassing myself." The words felt like gasoline on an open flame. I clenched my jaw, swallowing the bitter taste in my mouth. The man behind her, the bastard who had taken what was mine, had the audacity to smirk. "Man, just leave. You're not gonna change anything by standing here." She made her choice. She made her choice. Something inside me twisted. It wasn't just anger anymore. It was something colder. Sharper. I exhaled, slow and controlled. "Yeah," I murmured. "She did." I turned and walked out, not because I was weak, not because I was giving up, but because I knew this wasn't over. Not yet. The drive home was a blur. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, but my mind was clearer than it had been in months. Maybe even years. I replayed every moment, every red flag I had ignored. The way she had started dressing up more when she left the house. The way she laughed a little too hard at texts she never let me see. The sudden work trips, the coldness in our bed. It had been in front of me the whole time, and like a fool, I had looked away. Not anymore. By the time I reached our house, no, my house, the rage had settled into something steadier. A dark determination. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The silence felt different now. Not empty, not lonely, just peaceful. Then I saw them. The wedding photos on the wall, the smiling faces frozen in time, mocking me. The life I had built, the love I had given, all shattered in a single night. I took them down one by one. Some, I smashed. Others, I simply threw into a pile. Then I moved to our bedroom, my bedroom now. Her clothes were still hanging neatly in the closet, her perfume still lingering in the air. Disgust curled in my stomach. I grabbed a suitcase and started throwing her things in. I don't know how long it took, but by the time I was done, her side of the closet was empty. The suitcase sat by the front door, a silent statement of everything I had decided. I picked up my phone. My fingers hovered over her number. I could already imagine her reaction. The screaming, the insults, the fake tears. No. She wasn't worth the breath it would take to argue. Instead, I sent a single text. "Your things are packed. They'll be outside. You don't live here anymore." Then, for the first time in a long time, I felt something close to peace. I wasn't the one who lost something tonight. She was. The morning after felt surreal. The house was quiet, too quiet. My phone buzzed on the nightstand. "You're joking, right?" I stared at the message, unreadable. Then another. "You don't get to do this to me." A bitter chuckle escaped my lips. I didn't get to do this. I was the one who had been betrayed. My fingers hovered over the screen before I finally typed. You already did this to yourself." I turned off my phone. Let her scream into the void. The banging on the front door came an hour later. Predictable. I didn't rush. I took my time walking downstairs, making sure every step was deliberate. By the time I opened the door, she was standing there, breathless and furious, her arms crossed over her chest like she was the victim. "You're out of your damn mind if you think you're throwing me out," she spat. I leaned against the doorframe, arms folded. "I already did." Her eyes darted past me into the house, scanning for something, anything, that would give her leverage. "We need to talk." "We really don't." She scoffed, shoving past me before I could stop her. She stormed into the living room, looking around as if expecting things to be different. But everything was exactly the same, except for the absence of her presence. "You can't just erase me," she hissed, turning on me. "This is our home." "It was," I corrected. "Now it's mine." Her nostrils flared, her hands balling into fists. "You're acting like I'm some kind of monster." "I made a mistake." "You made a choice," I interrupted. "And now you get to live with it." Her breath hitched, her eyes searching mine for something, remorse, weakness, doubt. She found none. I pointed to the suitcase by the door. "Take your things and go. I won't ask again." For a moment, I thought she might refuse. That she might fight harder, try to manipulate her way back in. But something in my eyes must have told her the truth, this was final. With a huff, she grabbed the suitcase and dragged it outside, but not before throwing one last dagger at me. "You'll regret this." The door clicked shut behind her. And for the first time in years, I knew I wouldn't. The moment the door clicked shut, an unfamiliar stillness settled over the house. It wasn't just quiet, it was the absence of her presence, the end of something that had once felt permanent. And yet, as I stood there, staring at the space where she had just been, I didn't feel relief. Not yet. I took a deep breath, running a hand through my hair. The weight of the last 24 hours pressed down on me like an anchor, heavier than I expected. I had won. I had stood my ground. But why did it feel so hollow? I walked through the house, my footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The memories clung to every room, the laughter that once filled the kitchen, the whispered conversations in the bedroom, the way her perfume used to linger in the hallway long after she had left for work. I shook my head, pushing the thoughts away. That was the past. The woman I had loved had died long before last night. I was just too blind to see it. I needed to get out. The house felt suffocating now, too full of ghosts. Grabbing my keys, I stepped outside, the crisp morning air biting against my skin. The world outside moved on, oblivious to the implosion of my marriage. Cars passed, joggers ran by, and life continued as if nothing had happened. Because to the world, nothing had. I drove aimlessly for a while, letting the streets blur past, each mile putting more distance between me and the wreckage of my old life. Eventually, I found myself parked in front of a bar. It was early, too early, but I didn't care. Inside, the bartender gave me a knowing look but didn't ask questions. I ordered a drink, staring at the amber liquid in my glass, watching the way the light refracted through it. "Rough morning?" a voice asked beside me. I turned to see a woman, maybe in her early 30s, watching me with mild curiosity. She had dark eyes, sharp features, and an air of someone who had seen her share of broken people. I gave a humorless chuckle. Something like that. She didn't press. Instead, she raised her own glass. "To fresh starts, then." I hesitated for only a moment before clinking my glass against hers. Maybe she was right. Maybe this wasn't just an ending. Maybe it was the beginning of something else. The whiskey burned as it slid down my throat, but I welcomed the sting. It was a distraction, something to focus on besides the gaping void that had opened up inside me. The woman beside me had turned her attention to her own thoughts, tapping her fingers idly against the rim of her glass. We were just two strangers in a bar, both trying to escape something. "You don't look like someone who drinks alone often," she mused, not looking at me. I exhaled through my nose. That obvious? She shrugged. There's a difference between drinking for fun and drinking to forget. You're doing the latter. I didn't argue because she wasn't wrong. Instead, I took another sip and let the silence stretch between us. It was comfortable, in a way. No expectations, no forced conversation, just existing. Eventually, she finished her drink and slid a few bills onto the counter. Good luck, she said simply before walking away, disappearing into the sea of people outside. I sat there for a while longer, nursing my drink, watching the ice melt into the amber liquid. When I finally left, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows over the streets. I didn't want to go home, not yet. But there was nowhere else to go. So I drove. The city blurred past, neon lights flashing in the growing darkness, and somewhere along the way, I ended up in front of an old friend's house. Someone who had warned me about her, someone I hadn't listened to. I hesitated before knocking. What did I even want? Advice? Validation? A reminder that I wasn't completely alone in this? The door opened, and there he was, Mike, my best friend since college, his expression shifting from confusion to understanding in an instant. Jesus, man, he muttered, stepping aside. Come in. I did, and the weight on my chest felt just a little lighter. Mike didn't ask questions right away. He just handed me a beer and nodded toward the couch. The house smelled the same as it always had, faintly of old books and coffee, a comforting mix of nostalgia and familiarity. I sat down heavily, running a hand over my face as he settled into the armchair across from me. So, he said after a moment, his voice even. She finally did it, huh? I let out a hollow chuckle. You sound like you saw it coming. He scoffed. Come on, man. We all saw it coming. You just didn't want to. The words stung, not because they were cruel, but because they were true. I had ignored every warning sign, every gut feeling, every knowing glance from friends who had been too polite to say what they really thought. Now I was sitting here, broken, trying to make sense of the wreckage. Mike leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. What now? The question hung in the air between us. I had no answer. I don't know, I admitted. I feel like I should be angry. I should want revenge or, hell, I don't even know. But mostly, I just feel empty. Mike nodded, as if he understood. Maybe he did. That's normal. You gave everything to someone who didn't deserve it. You're running on fumes now. I took a slow sip of my beer, staring at the wall. What did you do? When Emily left. His jaw tightened for a moment, but then he sighed. I drank too much. Made some stupid decisions. But eventually, I stopped trying to understand why she did what she did and started figuring out who I was without her. That hit me harder than I expected. Who was I without her? I had spent years building my life around my wife, making compromises, trying to be what she wanted. Now she was gone, and all that was left was a man I barely recognized. Mike must have seen something in my expression, because he clapped a hand on my shoulder. You'll get through this. It's going to suck for a while, but you'll come out stronger. I exhaled slowly. I hope so. He smirked. I know so. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of the moment settling in. Eventually, Mike stood. Stay the night. Crash in the guest room. You shouldn't be alone right now. I considered arguing, but I was too tired. Too drained. Yeah. Thanks, man. He nodded, tossing me a spare pillow. Get some rest. Tomorrow, we start picking up the pieces. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. His words echoed in my head. Tomorrow, we start picking up the pieces. I just wasn't sure if I had the strength to do it. Sleep didn't come easy that night. I lay in the guest room, staring at the ceiling, my mind replaying every moment of the past few days like a cruel movie I couldn't turn off. The silence of the house was almost suffocating. No distant hum of her hairdryer, no sound of her moving around in the kitchen. Just stillness, heavy and oppressive. I finally drifted off somewhere near dawn, only to be woken by the sound of movement downstairs. The scent of coffee wafted through the air, and for a split second, I forgot where I was. My body tensed instinctively, expecting to hear her voice call out my name like she used to when she wanted something. But then reality hit, and I remembered, I wasn't home. Not anymore. Dragging myself out of bed, I made my way downstairs. Mike was already up, flipping through the news on his phone, a steaming mug of coffee in his hand. "Morning," he greeted without looking up. "Morning." My voice was rough, my throat dry. He nodded toward the counter. "Coffee's fresh. Help yourself." I poured a cup, the warmth of the mug grounding me. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. It wasn't an awkward silence, it was the kind of quiet that only old friends could share. Comfortable, understanding. "Any plans for today?" Mike finally asked. I let out a slow breath. No idea. Figure I should do something, though. Can't just sit around and mope. Mike smirked. Moping has a shelf life. But yeah, you should get out. Go somewhere, clear your head. It wasn't a bad idea. The house was suffocating, filled with ghosts of the life I used to have. Maybe fresh air would help. Yeah, I agreed. Maybe I'll go for a drive. I didn't have a destination in mind. I just drove. The city blurred past, then the suburbs, and eventually, I found myself on the highway, miles of open road stretching ahead. There was something liberating about it, just me, the hum of the engine, and nothing to hold me down. After a while, I ended up in a small coastal town I hadn't visited in years. It was the kind of place people went to escape, the streets lined with mom-and-pop shops, the scent of salt and fried food hanging in the air. I parked near the boardwalk and stepped out, stretching. The breeze was cool, carrying the distant sounds of waves crashing against the shore. Wandering down the boardwalk, I passed a few shops, my gaze catching on the old bookstore I used to visit when I was younger. On impulse, I stepped inside. The bell above the door chimed as I entered, the scent of aged paper and wood filling my lungs. The place was exactly as I remembered, dimly lit, packed with shelves that seemed to stretch forever. "Can I help you find something?" I turned to see a woman standing behind the counter. She looked to be in her early 30s, with sharp green eyes and auburn hair pulled back in a messy bun. There was something familiar about her, but I couldn't place it. "Just looking," I said. She gave a small smile. "Take your time." I wandered through the aisles, fingers skimming over the spines of books. I had no idea what I was looking for, maybe nothing. Maybe just an escape. "You know, you look really familiar," the woman said after a few moments. "Did you used to come here when you were younger?" I frowned, turning back to her. "Yeah, actually. Used to visit all the time when I was a kid." Her eyes lit up with recognition. "Wait, Ethan, right?" It hit me then. "Lena." She laughed. "I knew you looked familiar. It's been years." Lena had been a childhood friend, someone I used to run around town with during the summers when my family vacationed here. Seeing her now, all grown up, was a strange kind of nostalgia. "Wow," I said. "I can't believe it's you. You work here now?" She nodded. "Took over after my dad retired." "And you? What brings you back?" I hesitated, debating how much to say. "Just, needed to get away for a bit." Lena's expression shifted slightly, like she understood more than I was saying. "Rough week?" I let out a humorless chuckle. "Something like that." She didn't press, which I was grateful for. Instead, she leaned against the counter. "Well, since you're here, why not let me recommend something? Might help clear your head." I nodded. "Sure." She disappeared into the aisles for a moment before returning with a book. "Here." I took it from her, reading the title. It was a novel about second chances, about rebuilding after everything falls apart. I smirked. "Subtle." She grinned. "Just a lucky guess." I bought the book and tucked it under my arm. As I stepped toward the door, Lena called out. "Hey, Ethan." I turned back. "If you ever need a break from whatever it is you're running from, this town's not a bad place to start over." I nodded, considering her words. Maybe she was right. As I stepped out onto the boardwalk again, the weight on my chest felt just a little lighter. The book sat on the passenger seat as I drove back toward the city, Lena's words lingering in my mind. This town's not a bad place to start over. Start over. Was that what I needed? The thought unsettled me. I had spent so long building a life with her, my ex-wife, that I had never stopped to consider what my life might look like without her. Now, I had nothing but time to figure it out. The drive back was quieter than before. No music, no distractions. Just the road and my thoughts, unraveling like a tangled thread. I thought about Mike's advice, about how I had spent years giving myself to someone who didn't deserve it. It was time to start asking myself what I wanted. By the time I reached the city, the sun had dipped below the skyline, casting everything in shades of orange and purple. I parked outside my house now, and sat there for a moment, staring at the darkened windows. I had packed her things, thrown out the remnants of our past, but the house still felt haunted. Not by ghosts, but by the version of me that had lived there before. The man who had ignored every red flag, who had clung to love even when it had turned into poison. I stepped inside, flipping on the lights. The silence wasn't as oppressive this time. It was just, there. I dropped my keys on the counter and glanced at the book Lena had given me. Maybe it was time to stop running from things and start figuring out what came next. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of purpose. It wasn't clarity, not yet, but it was something. After making coffee, I sat at the kitchen table and pulled out my laptop. There were things I needed to take care of, bank accounts, name changes, the legal mess of separating our lives. I started drafting emails, canceling joint subscriptions, making lists of things I needed to replace. Each step was a small victory, a thread untangling itself. The more I did, the less I felt like I was suffocating. Then, on impulse, I opened a search tab and typed in the name of the coastal town I had visited yesterday. I clicked through rental listings, scrolling through pictures of small apartments overlooking the water, cozy homes tucked between narrow streets. It was tempting. A fresh start in a place that didn't hold memories of her. A place where I could figure out who I was outside of that failed marriage. But was I ready? The thought of uprooting my life was daunting. Everything I had built was here. My job, my friends, my routines. But routines could be broken, and friends would understand. I stared at the screen, my fingers hovering over the keyboard. Then, without thinking too hard, I sent a few inquiries to landlords. Just to see. Maybe this was how it started, not with some grand epiphany, but with small steps towards something new. Maybe, for the first time in a long time, I was choosing me. A week passed, and every day, the weight on my chest felt a little lighter. The emails I had sent to landlords had turned into conversations. Conversations had turned into possibilities. One place in particular stuck with me, a small rental just outside the coastal town, with a view of the water and a quiet street where no one knew my name. It wasn't anything grand, but it didn't need to be. It was enough. The decision wasn't impulsive. I let it sit, turning it over in my mind, playing out scenarios of what life might look like there. Would I be running away? Or was this simply, moving on? Mike, of course, had his opinions. You sure about this? You don't have to leave just to prove something, man. I'm not proving anything, I told him. I just think I need a fresh start. He exhaled, rubbing his jaw. All right. But if you start writing poetry about the ocean and drinking fancy lattes, I'm dragging you back. I smirked. Deal.